Hello, my name is Asha Clarke, and I'm here with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today is July 11th, 2023. It's just about 4:30, and we're here in Pensacola at the Pensacola Downtown Library. I am here with
Lorena Manasturean.
And we're so excited to talk with you today. Could you start out by introducing yourself as well as spelling your name for the record?
Sure. My name is Grace Resendez McCaffery, GraceResendez McCaffery.
Thank you so much. And just to start out, could you tell us a bit about yourself and where you're born, where you're from?
I'm originally from El Paso, Texas. Grew up on the border. It's a big desert town, but I've been in Pensacola since 1993.
And could you start by telling us a little bit about what it was like growing up on the border?
Way different than growing up in Florida. I mean, living in Florida. So I grew up seeing Mexico from my front yard. It's still something I enjoy seeing whenever I go visit my high school and my mom's house. You know, it's just that close to Mexico, and it helps me kind of stay grounded, rooted. Yeah.
Staying grounded, staying rooted. Is your family from Mexico?
My mother's, yes, actually. Yeah. My father's side claims Spain more than Mexico, but they did live in Mexico at some point. Yeah.
And what role did growing up in a Mexican, or at least on your mom's side, a Mexican household, what role did that play in your upbringing in El Paso?
So my mother's side is indigenous, or my father's side, like I said, they're more European. They're both, of course, Mexican background, but I would say probably my mother's family's probably had more an influence on my upbringing and kind of culture, which is kind of conservative with some cultural tendencies in there. It's different. It's a Mexican American as much as that might be defined. Yeah.
And how would you define being a Mexican American?
It's multicultural or bicultural anyway. You know, you're raised to be American and speak English and, you know, understand all of the American traditions, but still doing them with kind of a Mexican flair. Mm-hmm. Yeah, with kind of a Mexican accent to everything, so to speak. Yeah.
And which indigenous group from Mexico is your family, your mother's family, a part of?
So my mother's side is Tarahumara, which oddly they didn't really know. I actually researched this back in 2004. I did some family research as a means to kind of get through a grieving process. My husband was killed in a car accident after we moved here, and we had 2 little boys. And so that was my way of kind of getting through that, is kind of finding a project that I really dove into. And I started researching family and found them in 11 different states and people that had no idea that we were related or, you know, that kind of thing. But there was a family that was more connected to the family that's still in Mexico that kind of matched all the dots together and found out that was the indigenous community that we're from, northern Mexico.
That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you moved to Pensacola in, what was it, 1993?
December
1993. Could you outline that journey from growing up, high school, let's say, in El Paso, to finding your way to Pensacola?
Sure. So my husband was a traveling salesman, and he wound up in El Paso. We wound up working for the same company, and which was not allowed, to date people we worked with. And so we both wound up losing those jobs. But we stayed together. He was from Jacksonville, Florida, and still kind of a fish out of water, living in El Paso, and it wasn't really a place he was super comfortable with. He did speak Spanish. That's where the McCaffery name comes from. And so we kind of threw darts at a map. And we literally did that actually one day, just kind of, we were young and trying to see where we might go. And our little boy was born in El Paso, and I was about to have another one when a job opened up in Pensacola as a school photographer for him. And the company transferred us out here. And he knew of Pensacola. He had visited here when he was a kid, but it wasn't a community he was super familiar with. So we both kind of moved to a place where we knew nobody. But that's what we wanted. We wanted to do things on our own and see what life was gonna do. Unfortunately, after our second son was born that May, my husband was killed in a car accident in Tallahassee in that September, the following September, so about 9 months afterwards. And I decided to stay here, though. I decided that there was something that was telling me I needed to stay here at a time that really didn't make sense, but I found out 20 years later, I guess, that this is exactly where I needed to be and serve my calling. So I stayed.
And what is that calling? What is that thing that kind of kept you here?
So after a few years of grieving and trying to get back on my feet, so to speak, my kids starting kindergarten, I went back to school and I earned my degree at University of West Florida. I earned a degree in communications with a specialization in public relations, which, as it turned out, is exactly where my forte was, and it seemed to be just a natural thing for me to do. I went to school with the motivation or wanting to become the public relations director for the American Red Cross for the four-county area, Northwest Florida, and I was actually offered that job my senior year of school. Unfortunately, after 9/11, donations started dropping off for the Red Cross, for the organization, and so there was a lot of cutbacks, and the chapter actually reduced in size. It still is small today, from what I understand, but at the time it was a very visible organization. So that was not going to be a long-term career for me. I wound up working for some other nonprofits, in Independence for the Blind of West Florida. I worked for the health department briefly, and then I went to work for Escambia County as well. Somewhere in there, we had a big hurricane in 2004. Hurricane Ivan hit Pensacola directly, and it caused damage that the area hadn't seen in 70 years. Somehow I knew that things were going to change quickly because the area, Pensacola essentially became an island. The bridges were broken east and west and south. And there was finally a passage north that was cleared to start allowing things to come in and out of the area. One of the big concerns was getting insurance adjusters here to assess the damage. Once we started to get insurance companies into the area, they started looking around, and then we're trying to figure out how to get materials in to start rebuilding. And that was when people realized that we didn't have the manpower. And that just seemed to be where the light bulb turned on, that we were about to experience a big cultural change, a shift. So we started getting a lot of Spanish-speaking construction workers in the area, roofers, all kinds of construction, and people just started going to work, and they were coming in left and right. And because I had already started my career, and I was pretty well known in the community with my professional network, I just started getting phone calls from different organizations saying, we've got a Spanish-speaking gentleman here at the hospital, or, in different places that they needed help with communication. So I actually started an organization called the Language Bank of Northwest Florida. And that was for the purpose of recruiting volunteers to help just facilitate communication for foreign language speakers. Of course, the majority were Spanish speakers, but we wound up with over 25 different languages, over 100 volunteers within a couple of weeks. The local media was very interested in what I was doing because so much was happening so fast, so many changes were happening, and I just knew that there was going to be some issues coming up, with foreign language speakers taking such a large role in the community, helping to facilitate that communication and those cultural issues that might come up. And so I developed this network of volunteer interpreters just to help at the hospitals or wherever we could do them. We would three-way phone calls wherever we needed to. So yeah, most of the calls were Spanish, for Spanish speakers. And eventually, of course, we realized that for every phone call I was getting, there were probably a couple hundred calls I wasn't getting, for people that needed help with things. So I quickly gained greater appreciation for mass communications and needed to develop something. So that's where the newspaper came in. It was a matter of just trying to get information out as quickly as possible to help people understand where those hospitals were, what were kind of the local resources and activities, things going on in the area. Of course, everybody was just working. At the same time, I am trying to help the existing community, the previously existing community, understand more about who these Spanish speakers are, where they're from, that kind of thing, and trying to kind of bridge the gap as much as I could.
On that note, what was the pre-existing English-speaking kind of Pensacola population? What was their reaction to this increase in language access? So these three-way phone calls that you did for, at the hospitals, was there any pushback to that? Were people receptive? How did that come about?
Not so much from the organizations, like the hospital. The hospitals were not necessarily, objecting to things, but it was an issue they weren't prepared for. So to find out that there were volunteer interpreters that could help with situations, you could see that there was things had to happen in phases. First, let's take care of what's happening right now, facilitate these communication issues that were happening, and then let's look into hiring staff that were multilingual, at least bilingual, that could also help. Because we could have all the volunteers in the world, but we couldn't be everywhere at any moment, as much as we tried. But it was some of the more kind of critical things that we wanted to make sure that there was some type of support system in place. And the word got around quickly, that there was a community of interpreters or Spanish speakers, bilingual speakers that were willing to help in doing what we could, and just need to centralize that, which we did. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Community-wise, wasn't altogether that nice. There were some people that were not happy to have foreign language speakers living next door. There was a town hall meeting with a then congressman. Do we mention names?
As long as you're comfortable.
Sure. Then Congressman Jeff Miller came to town to do a town hall meeting. I happened to be working in the building as I was working for the county at the time. He used the county commission chambers for that. And I volunteered to lock up the place since I worked in the building and I wanted to stay for the meeting. I sat with the media people and I sat with our county administrator as we listened to some rough stuff. People complaining about people speaking Spanish and being called derogatory names on the record. I recall being the only Hispanic in the room. And it was only because I worked there. The meeting wasn't really announced publicly. Constituents were invited. And so as the word got out, there was some folks that did show up, but they had to wait outside. So the room inside was packed, of course, with constituents that were there to complain that we had Spanish-speaking construction workers rebuilding. And that was hard. That was hard to hear. A little bit scary. But I was sitting next to our county administrator that just stood by me. And that was helpful. Yeah. Starting the newspaper was also rough. I received some phone calls, threatening phone calls for a while that I just didn't understand. I couldn't understand why this would bother people, why people would object to helping other people. I didn't register that at all. But
and if you can recall, what was the subject matter of these phone calls? What were they threatening you with, or what were they citing as their reason for
there was a couple that just straight up said they were wanting to kill me. Yeah, and I was still a single mother with little kids, and all I was doing was sharing information, public information. 4th of July is coming up. There's there's fireworks. You can't, be careful. Safety issues, riptides, stuff like that. Just helping people become familiar with their environment, their new environment, and giving them information to make decisions to be safe. I couldn't understand why this bothered people. And it was scary for a while. I guess it's made me a little tougher, but it still, I still look over my shoulder. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I know it can't be easy to recall. But if, for the record, you'd like to say the name of the newspaper,
Sure.
The year it was founded, things of that nature.
So I published La Costa Latina newspaper, and the company's Latino Media Gulf Coast. And it's we publish twice a month. It started off monthly, just slowly, just kind of newsletterish, after a while, of course, businesses wanted to advertise, so to help support it. They wanted to advertise so that they could reach this new market. But of course, that supports the newspaper even today. And so I started publishing back in 2005. Actually, Cinco de Mayo was the big jump off, and we started it with a Latino Expo. So not only were we getting information out, but we were inviting people to a place to be face-to-face with organizations like the sheriff's department or the hospitals or the baseball team, to not only help them become familiar with our community becoming familiar with them, but also just kind of finding that common ground. Our baseball team, for example, at the time, many of the players were from Venezuela. So it helped a lot of our construction workers, to see Spanish speakers doing some other things here in the area that were different. And it just kind of showed a little bit more support and growth for the time.
And what was the reception of the initial publication of the newspaper in 2005 from the Spanish-speaking community?
gosh, I don't know that I recall a response other than, still today we just have such a good relationship with our community. I have visions in my head remembering people waiting. They see us pull up to fill the newspaper bin and waiting for that hot off the press copy. So, of course, there was that kind of a satisfaction of seeing something established. I know that it helped a lot of people to see me in this role. At the time, of course, I wore a uniform as a county employee. I worked in the county commission communications, the public information office. And so I worked with all of the departments of the county. And so whether it's a restaurant that's opening up or a facility that, had some code enforcement issues, stuff like that I would be able to help facilitate the communication and represent kind of both sides of the situation. And I could maybe even help a business owner become more at ease with communicating with the county because there's a Hispanic person, there at that moment to help fix the situation that they're dealing with. So there were things like that. But I think the newspaper kind of served that same kind of, property that there was kind of a sense of connection to the community.
Would you say there are certain countries that most of Pensacola's kind of Latinx population hail from in particular, your readers?
At that time, back when it first started growing back in 2005, it was mostly from Mexico. The last 4 years or so, it's been mostly from Honduras. Yeah. I do think we're going to start to see some others from other places. After Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, we did start to see some folks from Puerto Rico, but this is a really difficult place to live when you're an American citizen and don't speak English, because you have all of the accessibility of an American citizen, employment, all this kind of stuff, but you don't speak the language, and there's not enough to support, at least, yet, to support a large Spanish-speaking workforce. I haven't seen a lot of them stay around from Puerto Rico too much. They tried it, but they wound up having to live like immigrants here, which was frustrating. And they were already in such a kind of frustrating situation, having to leave the island because of the storm, losing their homes and everything that they had there, and then coming to a place they'd probably never heard of before on the invitation of a friend or relative, and just struggling to find employment with the language limitations. So going to a bigger city, it may not have been ideal. That's not necessarily what they wanted, but easier to find more resources. Yeah.
And what role would you say that the newspaper plays in easing concerns or fears of especially recently immigrated Latinx families in integrating into the community to the extent that they can?
Well, aside from the newspaper, I am kind of known as the community advocate. And so I am often in the situation of kind of being an intermediary between organizations, industries and stuff, and the community itself. So whether it is a company that's looking to, reach the market for some reason, whether it's services or employment or whatever, or right now as we're dealing with a state immigration law, relaying this information to our local officials so that they understand what's going on with our community because of this law. And then that also easing some of the anxiety of the community itself. There's a lot of fear that came out of the announcement of the law right away, helping our community understand exactly what's in the law, what it means, and how it may or may not change their lives. But most of all, just knowing that there's somebody here speaking on their behalf seems to be a big deal.
And to clarify, which law is this that you're talking about, and what does it entail for the immigrant Latinx population of Pensacola?
So it's Florida SB 1718, was signed into law, I believe, May 11th, in May. And so it's been very destabilizing for our Latino community, or possibly our immigrant community. I'm not sure how it's affected our Asian and European groups. Not sure how that's affected those groups, but initially we're hearing from realtors that were saying that there are folks that are just selling their houses and leaving. There's a lot of fear, not knowing what it meant. I think the driver's license issue is probably the biggest effect than anything, because we do have folks that have lived in other states and they've gotten a driver's license from another state, and for whatever reason they came here, or for whatever reason they obtained a driver's license from another state, those are no longer valid here, which raised questions about whether or not their auto insurance is valid, can they still have it? What does that mean? So people had to make decisions on whether to stay in Florida. And I know that a lot of people have left.
And you mentioned earlier, when you were describing the language bank of Northwest Florida, that you had, I believe you said like about 25 languages. And I wanted to know, in the process of creating the language bank, and in the process of like gathering all of these, obviously having this many languages means that it came out of a necessity for these languages. I wanted to know what other communities have you encountered through the language bank that, demographics that you might not initially have expected to, and essentially, what have you maybe learned or seen about other immigrant communities in Pensacola?
So I received a phone call from a hospital one day. I could hear a woman screaming in the background. They said she was in a lot of pain and that she needed surgery, and she was Creole. And so they wanted to know if I had somebody that could speak French. And I said, I do have a French speaker. He was not sure that he could communicate well enough, but he was willing to give it a try. They wanted him to explain to her that she needed surgery, that she would feel much better after the surgery. She needed to sign the documents giving them permission to perform the surgery, and that she would feel much better afterwards. And I could hear the tone in her voice just saying, mercy, mercy. Even I know what that means, and just that relief that somebody in the room, even though it was on the phone, spoke her language and let her know things are going to be okay here with people that are trying to take care of you. We've got to take care of this paperwork, but if you give them permission to take care, to treat you, you'll feel better. And it's just translation. So there's been situations like that. I've had to provide an Estonian. Strangely, I had somebody, I can't remember the situation for that, but I had somebody on file to do that call. We did more recently have a Farsi speaker, kind of similar situation. A husband was pacing the hallway in the hospital while his wife was in surgery, and the hospital staff was concerned for him because he seemed very worried and this kind of thing. And I happened to have a Farsi speaker on my list of volunteers, connected the call, and they were chuckling after a while. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but what was interpreted was that the man was just pacing, and he was perfectly comfortable with the treatment his wife was getting, and he laughed because he didn't realize that everybody thought he was worried. And they just tell him I'm fine, and just I'm just passing the time. So it wasn't the situation they were worried about. The communication is just so important, and so much I think is alleviated. So such bad situations happen for lack of communication, not necessarily language barriers, but just not being able to communicate. Sometimes not giving the time to communicate. I ran into a bus station several years ago to take a friend of mine. This was back when I was studying at the university. She was going home for Thanksgiving, I believe. When I got to the bus station, these two ladies came running up to me, and they were speaking very fast in Spanish, and I had to calm them down, let one of you tell me what's going on. And once they explained it to me, I went to the counter and I told the agent, the bus station agent there, that these ladies had gotten off the bus to use the restroom, and the bus left without them. And he said, I already told them the next bus to Houston is at 7. And he interrupted me. He didn't let me finish talking. So I said, no, sir, they were on their way to Tampa. And then he says, oh, well, that next bus leaves at, another time. I said, no, sir, you don't understand. This lady's son is on the bus, and the bus left without him. He doesn't speak English. His face just turned red, and he started fumbling. I said, let's all calm down. And just, is there a way to reach the bus driver? And he said, yes, okay, let's do that. And I kind of had to walk through that. And I offered to take her to meet the bus. If they could stop the bus at the next station or something, I would take them. And within the time that I was there, they were actually able to communicate. The little boy, there was somebody on the bus that spoke Spanish trying to calm him down, saying, your mom's coming. And so they did manage the situation, but I just kept thinking, what if I hadn't walked in at that moment? This was a little 7-year-old boy. How would they have ever met back up? And I just looked around trying to find out what would somebody do if they didn't speak English here. And it turns out the bus station did have access to the language line, which is, I think, an international service. Mm-hmm. But he never bothered to call. It was something that he could have just picked up the phone and had an interpreter make sure that he understood. All he understood was Houston. What she said was she came from Houston. He was about to send her in the wrong direction. I just can't imagine all the situations like that may have happened just because somebody didn't take the time to communicate. It just told me what I needed to do. That's where I believe that's when the language bank happened. That's when I started promoting it, putting that phone number out, because I realized that's right. That when I was looking around, I was looking at like the phone booth and stuff, and thinking that somebody, if there was a phone number, then this lady could have at least called, and then I could have three-way to call or something like that. That's how I found out that the bus station had access to the language line, and he should have done that. So there's just some education that was needed to help our community become more familiar with living with people from other countries and cultures and languages.
Another question. Obviously, when you began this project, at least with the newspaper, it began around 2005 with print media. How has the surgence, let's say, of the internet, of social media affected the work that you do in this community?
I have a readership that is kind of 50-50. I survey them every now and then. I mostly use Facebook because it still is the most common one that folks use. But I still have a considerable amount of people that aren't using their phones for social media and or for those purposes, and still like to hold a newspaper. And so it just has increased our ability actually to reach more people. And there's some that actually use both. They like both. But there's some that prefer print, there's some that prefer digital, and then there's some that actually use both. And so it's enhanced it, it's increased our readership. And it hasn't killed it at all, if that's what you're getting at. Yeah.
No, I was just curious. And for your language bank, because you mentioned, Spanish, but Farsi, Estonian, how do you find these volunteers who speak these different languages?
So a lot of it now is just because I meet people all the time for different reasons. I may find a new store that might like to have our newspaper there and get to know the owners from some country or whatever. That's actually how I met the Farsi speaker. He's actually Canadian, but he speaks Farsi. His family's, I forget the whole story of his family, but that's how he speaks the language. But he owns a Mexican store. So you just meet people. Back when I started, though, it was other media that were actually featuring the work that I was doing. I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen it before or since that a newspaper made the front page of another newspaper because they appreciated so much the work that we were doing to just kind of bridge this whole thing that was happening to the community. That, I mean, I'd get random calls from the local news station, the TV station. What's going on these days? I'm like, well, I just, published a story about, okay. And then they'd mention it in a kind of a blurb in the news. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty neat. So it was always a kind of a balance between, I'd say not much of a balance because there was more support than there was pushback. Just the pushback was pretty harsh, but the support still is, and it's even stronger now, but was always there.
And have you been able to build relationships with other organizations in other parts of Florida that are doing this language access and Latinx community outreach work?
In other parts of the state, the only one that I can think of that I've, really kind of involved myself with is like the advocates like FLIC, Florida Immigrant Coalition, because of their advocacy, for undocumented immigrants, farm workers, and we have to have a unified voice in making sure people understand their rights. Even as undocumented immigrants, people don't realize that they have rights. Making sure that everybody knows this. So it's a resource that I come back to periodically.
Mm-hmm. And even in like hospitals, government-owned spaces, there's supposed to be an interpreter on hand, right, for people to have access to. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, there simply weren't for Pensacola residents. So, yeah, super important.
That has changed considerably. I mean, they have started hiring people, especially Spanish speakers, but there is more resource now. It happened so fast. They didn't know what to do as it was happening back in 2004, 2005. It just happened so fast. We're almost 20 years out now, and so they've learned a lot. They still struggle, like anybody, with hiring people that not only are qualified workers but will stay. And then adding to that multi-language speakers, that's a tough order to fill. But it's on the radar now, where it wasn't before. So.
And what are your hopes for the work that you do going into the future, for future Pensacola?
Gosh. I would like for it to continue to grow the way it has. I think that Pensacola has a unique immigrant community within the Hispanic community. And what I mean by that is in other, especially larger places, you see Salvadorians go one neighborhood and Colombians in another neighborhood, and you just kind of separate themselves because it's how they're comfortable. But because I think of how we grew and how we managed the growth through the newspaper, through events, through advocacy and all this kind of stuff, I think we have a unique community in that everybody's on the same page, so to speak. I always want to use that for my tagline for my newspaper, by the way, just because it just sounds so great. But
You heard it here first.
but it is unique. I mean, I lived in Brooklyn for a little while, in New York for a little while, exactly 1 year, and I saw that happening there. I'm like, why are Dominicans in this neighborhood, or why is this neighborhood mostly Honduran or whatever? And because they're so powerful as a community together. And I realized that's actually what we did here. And I feel really good about that. And I still work on helping folks that have been working with me for years, from the beginning, to folks that are just new here, and help them understand we're not concerned that you're Mexican or Peruvian or wherever you're from. We're all familia, which is how I refer to my readers, my followers on our social media. When I address everyone, it's familia, not you guys, and it's so that they understand that I'm not asking questions about your nationality. I'm not asking questions about your immigration status. Here's what's happening to the family. Here's what's happening for the family, and just let's keep taking care of each other.
All right. Well, Grace, on behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, thank you so much for sitting down with us today, for telling us all the lovely work that you do, for giving us a better picture of Pensacola. Before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add or clarify?
I can no. I don't think so.
All righty. Well then, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was nice.